Our media are fully invested and dedicated to the idea that the only thing that alleviates you of the charge that you don't care about dead kids, the only thing that alleviates you of that charge is agreeing with them that wide-scale common sense gun reform, which they never happen to flesh out, is the answer. If you side with them, you are a member of the elect. You're a member of the predestined for heaven elect who never have to actually change policy to protect kids. All you have to do is say that you believe. If you clap hard enough for gun control Tinkerbell, then kids will not die anymore. That is what, we don't have to propose any policy that makes sense. We don't have to explain how that policy is well calibrated. We don't have to explain how we're going to effectuate that policy. We don't even have to explain how it would have stopped this shooting. We don't have to do any of that. All we have to do is just say we agree with you, and then you are magically a member of the virtuous. And if you're a member of the virtuous, solutions are completely unnecessary because then we are governed by angels. And if we are governed by angels, then no laws are necessary, no regulations are necessary. All the best will rule us. Here's an MSNBC guest who was going off on this yesterday. His name is Gregory Jackson, saying, we've seen clearly there's no such thing as a good guy taking out a bad guy, except for, again, this is literally how every one of these shootings eventually ends, is when good guys with guns stop bad guys with guns or intimidate them into killing themselves.
We've seen very clearly that, there's no such thing as a good guy with a gun taking out a bad guy with a gun. We saw that in Buffalo, someone who was a lifetime gun owner, a retired police officer and security guard who sacrificed his life trying to stop that gunman. But when you're someone going up against an assault rifle and a world of hate, unfortunately, people are getting outgunned every day.
This is just, it's garbage. It's just garbage. But the entire media are garbage. They are just a propaganda outlet on behalf of the left wing. Perfect example, today's Washington Post, going after, again, just as it's a coordinated attack now on the manufacturer of the gun. So the idea is that if you manufacture a weapon and then somebody goes and uses the weapon for an act of evil, somehow you're responsible for the use of that weapon in an act of evil. Logic we would never apply to any other weapon in the history of humanity. You would never apply it to knives. You would never apply it to cars. You would never apply it to any other object that could be used in a dangerous way. There are many objects that can be used in a dangerous way. But we never would suggest that the manufacturer and seller of that object is somehow responsible for the use of that object in a crime. That'd be a weird argument. But now they are arguing that not only should these manufacturers be held responsible, but that the manufacturers are actually in control of American politics. Because after all, who would not side with the angels? I mean, they've made you an offer. The offer is you can be on the side of the angels. So if you're not siding with the angels, it must be because somebody's paying you off. So you have the Washington Post today, quote, maker of rifle in Texas massacre is deep-pocketed GOP donor. First of all, are we supposed to be surprised that gun manufacturers typically support the party that does not want to restrict gun rights? Is that supposed to be a shock? This is somewhat like saying that the manufacturers of drugs that are used in abortions support the Democratic Party. Like, I would be shocked if they didn't support the Democratic Party. One of those parties supports laws that are in favor of the use of these products in a legal fashion. But this is bad, right? And the reason it's bad is because you're corrupt. You're corrupt. Did you know that you were paid by Daniel Defense? You were. If you don't support their agenda, it's because you got a check from Daniel Defense. That is why. It's not because you have independent thoughts in your head. It's not because you believe in the Second Amendment. None of that stuff. It's not because you're a gun owner. It's because you must have been paid off. Because otherwise, what else would explain your evil? I mean, after all, you don't need an AR-15 to shoot a deer in a Kevlar vest or some such nonsense. So here's the Washington Post today. Quote, the owners of Daniel Defense, the manufacturer of the rifle apparently used in the massacre of 21 people at an elementary school in Uvalde, Texas, are deep-pocketed Republican donors, giving to candidates and committees at the federal and state level aligned against limits on access to assault rifles and other semi-automatic weapons. The owners of the Georgia-based company have donated more than $70,000 directly to GOP candidates for federal office this election cycle, according to a review of filings with the FEC. Daniel Defense itself gave $100,000 last year to a PAC backing incumbent Republican senators. The spending by Marvin Daniel and his wife Cindy Daniel illustrates the financial clout of the gun industry, even as political spending by the NRA has declined in recent years. And it shows how surging gun sales during COVID have empowered manufacturers to expand their marketing and political advocacy. Experts say, oh, well, if the experts say so, well, then that means First of all, this is what we call elementary logic. If you are a gun manufacturer, you're going to support people who are in favor of your business continuing to thrive. You are probably a believer in the Second Amendment and the believer that people have a right to defend themselves with your weaponry. Is it a shock that you support this party? Why would you not support them? What, are you going to support the people who are literally saying that you're a murderer? Who want to make you liable for the use of weapons that you designed for self-defense to murder kids? Like, those are the people you're supposed to give them? What are you supposed to do? Come on. But the idea is, again, that it really is about the Republicans, right? The Republicans are evil. This company is evil. You can have your life destroyed at any moment, by the way, by any one of these members of the media. Any moment. Right? If your business comes under fire from the media, they will immediately dig up any donation you ever gave, and then they'll attempt to punish you on the front page of their newspaper. Because this is not journalism, it is just activism. Timothy Litton, a law professor at Georgia State University, says the ability of the industry to use money to advance its political agenda has increased given the dramatic rise in firearm sales we've seen over the last 2 or 3 years. So in other words, we can't actually show that anybody's been paid off or that any bribery occurs. We can't show that that's a thing that happens. What we can show is that people are buying more guns. Well, did it ever occur to Democrats? The reason over the last couple of years that people particularly have been buying a lot of guns is because they don't feel safe because you undermine the cops in every community in the United States. My wife and I thought seriously of buying additional guns, specifically because of the riots in California that were predominantly backed by major Democrats who refused to condemn them. But apparently we must have been paid by Daniel Defense or something. That's the only rationale for this. Meanwhile, you have the New York Times doing its own version of journactivism. On the front page, quote, where Senate Republicans stand on gun legislation. How about where Senate Democrats stand on hardening school safety standards? Where Democrats stand on putting armed guards in schools to protect your kids the same way that Democrats protect their money? I don't see that article from the New York Times, but again, they get to define the narrative. Always and forever, they define the narrative. It's one of the great frustrations of life is that whenever something happens, everybody on the right is expected to play defense. When there is a shooting at a Buffalo supermarket by a white supremacist who identifies as neither right nor left, you, normal everyday Republican voter, or you, independent voter who may not back a Democrat in this election cycle, you're forced on defensive to explain why you don't back that guy and why you don't back white supremacy and why he doesn't reflect your ideology. When there is a shooting by a person with obvious, serious mental issues in Texas, murdering school kids, you will be placed on defensive to explain why you do not back this, because they get to define the narrative. This is what the New York Times does. Quote, the New York Times reached out on Wednesday and Thursday to all 50 Republicans in the Senate to see whether they would support a pair of House-passed measures to strengthen background checks for gun buyers. Within hours of the elementary school shooting in Uvalde, Senate Democrats moved quickly to clear the way for possible votes on the two bills. That's a lie, because Senator Chuck Schumer says that he is not going to push those bills for at least another couple of weeks. The legislation would expand criminal background checks to would-be purchasers on the internet and at gun shows and give the FBI more time to investigate gun buyers flagged by the instant background check system. Okay, so that's not actually what the legislation does. It prevents people, if I want to sell a gun to my brother-in-law, for example, it would prevent me from doing that by creating a full-scale federal gun registry so that if the gun got transferred from me to my brother-in-law and then it was found at the scene of a crime, they could prosecute me. That's what that would be about. That's not, if you buy a gun over the internet, you have to, I've done it, you have to go to a federally licensed firearms dealer to pick up the gun, and they do a background check on you before you are allowed to take it home. The vast majority of Republicans, according to the New York Times, have opposed gun safety legislation for years, banding together to block its consideration or refusing to bring it up. Any deal in the 50-50 Senate would need the support of at least 10 Republicans. Most Republicans who have responded to the Times so far have either declined to take a position or signaled they would oppose the measures, citing concerns about infringing on the rights of gun owners. All but one Democrat is supportive, Senator Joe Manchin. So again, Democrats propose a thing, now Republicans explain why you don't support it. Explain. And then the New York Times has an entire piece in which it's just, this headline is just a lie. Uvalde had prepared for school shootings. It did not stop the rampage. Really? Did they prepare? How well were they prepared? How did that preparation go? In August 2020, law enforcement officers from 5 agencies converged inside the hallways of a school in Uvalde, Texas, their guns drawn, role-playing how they would halt a gunman. The training, detailed in documents reviewed by the New York Times, was part of an overhaul of security preparedness in Uvalde and across much of Texas. Uvalde school officials were doubling their budget for security, updating protocols, adding officers to the district's police department. As the city's separate police force dispatched its SWAT team in tactical gear to learn the layout of school buildings, but none of the extensive preparations halted the rampage of an 18-year-old gunman who entered an Uvalde elementary school this week and killed 19 children and 2 teachers. Again, this entire article is directed at the idea that no matter what you do to train cops, no matter how many armed guards you put on it, it's going to have to be gun laws that solves the problem. But obviously none of this was implemented. Obviously none of this mattered. There's little evidence nationally, says the New York Times, that the dollars poured into school security measures have decreased gun violence in schools, according to a 2019 study co-written by Jagdish Kubchandani, a professor of public health at New Mexico State University. These security measures are not effective, and they're not catching up to the ease of access with which people are acquiring guns in the pandemic. So I feel like those are two unrelated issues. One is, are the security protocols good? And two is the availability of guns. Those are two separate issues. But we're treating them as conflated because, again, the idea for the Democrats is if you talk about anything but gun control, then this means that you're in favor of shootings. But as I have suggested, the rate of school shootings, it seems to be largely at unprotected public schools, gun-free zones declared by law, where there is not sufficient protection. I don't know how many times you can argue this over and over. But they keep saying, well, the law enforcement training didn't do it. Well, maybe the law enforcement training isn't good enough. Maybe we haven't funded enough in order to harden these security protocols. We don't have any of the measures that we've talked about. But again, the idea is that the only way to do this is to widely confiscate weaponry, which is the only thing that they actually won't talk about. They won't actually talk about what they want. Because if they talked about what they want, they lose. And all of this is, in the end, about how they're morally outraged. And if you don't agree with me, you're not morally outraged. Roxanne Gage is saying the quiet part out loud at the New York Times, quote, "Don't talk to me about civility. On Tuesday morning, those children were alive." So I get to yell at you and claim that you love dead kids because, after all, I'm a good person and you're a bad person because you disagree with me. Incivility runs through the history of this country, says Roxanne Gay, founded on stolen land, built with the labor of stolen lives. The document that governs our lives effectively denied more than half of the population the right to vote. Again, this ties into a broader left-wing vision. The United States is evil from its root, and civility is just a way of facilitating that evil. So if we are uncivil, and if we are terrible to one another, and if we pretend that the people we disagree with actually like when kids get shot in school, then probably that will solve the problem. Or alternatively, it's not about solving the problem. It's just about making yourself feel good for doing things that are completely non-coordinated with the actual problem at hand. All right. Again, none of this is going to end with any action that prevents this sort of stuff. It's not going to. Because frankly, a lot of people don't want to talk about the stuff that actually solves these sorts of problems. Instead, they want a virtue signal. And virtue signaling may be good for election time money raising, but it is very not good for solving problems. How's this for a title? Ben Shapiro Show subscriber destroys like button with clicks and logic. I'd watch that. Make it happen, gang.